bottom
we
of your
go.
screen.
Oh,
You got it.
okay, I got it. We're all set. Okay, welcome everyone to today's event, which is on air. My name is Sally Snyder and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the coordinator of diversity programming here at Road Community College. All right, and I would like to share our mission with you, which is to enrich, support, and celebrate our diverse community by acting as a catalyst for inclusion, continuous learning, understanding, and acceptance through active engagement and facilitation of educational opportunities that challenge biases and deepen conversations. So today is our final event to honor the 4 chiefs. We've done programs on fire, water, land, and today is air. All of our diversity programming events can be found on the DPB webpage, and they're offered throughout the year free of charge. So if you would like to find those events, you may always go to the RCC homepage and search diversity events. So now it is my pleasure to introduce David West and Dr. Kathy Kemper-Pell. And just give me a moment here. Okay, so David West is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and he's the Director Emeritus for Native American Studies at Southern Oregon University, as well as the Kahnaway-Nicotilicum Academy for Native Youth, which is in its 30th year, 30 years. He's been a member of the Oregon Indian Education Association for 35 years, and he's also a member of the National Congress of American Indians. He's been selected as the Indian Educator of the Year and as the Elder of the Year in a different year by the same organization. He's officially retired, but as you can see, not really. He is more active than ever. In 2001, a beloved dean of RCC, Tennyson Haley, established an award and named it in his honor, the David D. West 7th Generation Diversity Award. And David is the very first recipient. He is a beloved part of this community and a dear friend to many. And Kathy Kemper-Pell is RCC's outgoing president. She started her career conducting environmental research at McNeese State University and later became a professor at Lone Star College, where she taught environmental biology and led student field experiences in Texas, Colorado, Arkansas. I really almost said Arkansas, and Costa Rica. Please join me in welcoming David and Kathy.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
And actually, before we go further, so I just want to welcome you. We are also going to have David do a land acknowledgement for us. All right, David.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. This weekend, Southern Oregon University Native American Student Union had their annual powwow gathering, and we were supported in that effort by the Phoenix High School and the utilization of their brand spanking new football field and stadium that has been built to replace the football field, stadium, and the soccer field that were lost in the fire in the Talent Phoenix Ashland area. It was really quite amazing that they offered this space to us, being that the field is brand new. But they told us that they always found that when we were at their school, and we've utilized their facilities many times over the years, that we always left the area, either the gymnasium or the outside fields, in better shape than we found them. And I just wanted to thank the Phoenix High School administration for that acknowledgement. And I thanked the crowd and asked them to do the same again when we left. And I got a phone call from one of the organizers yesterday telling me that when they had finished and everybody had left the field and they were getting ready to turn the lights off, that one of the groundskeepers said to one of the students there that you can't even tell anybody's been here. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. And that was a land acknowledgement in reverse. And so the one that we have now with the area tribes and communities is the one that we are utilizing here and have been utilizing here in these presentations. And I'd like to recognize the faculty of Native American programs and staff at Southern Oregon University, and the Grand Ronde tribal staff and the Siletz tribal staff for their development in this beautiful acknowledgement. It's a living statement. Go back down one. It continues to be a living statement through this ongoing partnership. On behalf of RCC, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge that Rogue Community College is located within the ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Takilma, and Lakgawa peoples who have lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, discovery and of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed, confederating these tribes and others together who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of their homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians are living descendants of the Takilma, Shasta, and Lakgawa peoples of this area. I encourage you to learn about the land you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous people. I'd like to take just this moment to add that I was reminded by the faculty from SOU that as departments are utilizing this land acknowledgement, which is the recognized land acknowledgement for the tribes of record for this area, that being Siletz and Grand Ronde, that something be looked at as a tangible effort to recognize this sovereignty and recognize the land acknowledgement, whether in curriculum or in sponsorship of events that look to the history and occupation of this land by the Indigenous peoples from time out of mind, so that the land acknowledgement doesn't become a kind of a rote statement that we just listen to being read. And the reason that we are reading it aloud is because we're oral tradition people. And our people tell us that the written word contains no life energy. It only receives and emits the life energy when spoken. And that in turn, when we take action to respond to what is represented in the land acknowledgement, creates that energy of reconciliation and reciprocity that leads to healing as we move forward with a determination for inclusion, recognition of diversity, and leadership as the Indigenous peoples in relationship to the Mother Earth and our relationships with her for the future. And so now I've delivered that message on behalf of my elders and my leaders that have asked for this to happen. And in doing so, I spoke with the director of Native programs, Dr. Brooke Colley, and we spoke about the beginning development of how we would move forward with creating coursework that articulated to the coursework available in the Native American Studies certificate and minor programs offered there. They are writing for a bachelor's degree, and it will be the only named Native American Studies or Indigenous Studies program in the state. The others are under ethnic studies. We're very happy about that. So hopefully we can look to the future and the utilization of our degreed teachers, certified teachers in the state of Oregon, perhaps finding positions at Rogue Community College to promote the advent of this articulation. So thank you for this time. I kind of sprung this on you, Kathy. I didn't mean to, but it just came up and I thought I should bring it forward.
I love it, David. I absolutely love it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're here talking about air today. And first of all, I want to thank you, Kathy, for the opportunity to have done these presentations, and to you, Sally, and all your network and connections and people that you utilize to bring about this and the work that on the diversity presentations and things. This has been a wonderful experience for me as an alumni, excuse me, and as an educator. Having a little trouble catching my air. Air is so important to us. And in our discussion notes, we had a question come up. How important is air? Well, how long can you hold your breath? It has its relevancy, and it has its life. Everything requires air, oxygen. And how we take care of it. How do you take care of the air? Well, for a lead in, you have to remember that plants respirate oxygen, and they breathe in what we breathe out, and conversely, we breathe in what they breathe out. That's reciprocity, that's a symbiotic relationship, and one that is important. And one of the things that our traditional ecological knowledge instructors tell us is to remember that exchange of oxygen, of breath, of life. And that when you have to do thinning, fuels reduction, invasive species removal, that it's always good that to remember that when you cut down those plants, they cease to respirate. And when they cease to respirate, they die. And there's a little bit less oxygen in the air for us to breathe. And so it would be important for us to remember that it's part of a way of looking about that relationship, not as an act of conversion, but as an act of instruction, to be thankful for the air and the life that the plants were providing and what they created, not only through their root systems, the support system of the mosses and all the biofoods and stuff and everything that Kathy knows all about, have that connection to each other and creates the very life that sustains ours. So.
Thanks, David. You know, when we talked about water, we talked about the concept of transpiration and the fact that plants also sweat. You know, when we sweat, we call it perspiration. When plants sweat, we call it transpiration, and they actually return water to the atmosphere through that process, but also oxygen. You know, through respiration, they're returning oxygen back to the atmosphere. And you know, as scientists, when I was driving to work this morning, I was thinking about how much science has changed since I was a freshman at Illinois Central College. My general biology textbook had no pictures in it. It was all text. And that was because they were just starting to use electron microscopes to understand the inner workings of the cell. And less than 5 years later, there were drawings of the organelles starting to appear inside of those textbooks. And we were starting to understand that there were chemical processes happening inside of cells in these organelles. And gosh, now we have pictures of molecules on the surface of those organelles and how they work and how oxygen is used to drive the energy making process inside of all of our cells. This is why we can't hold our breath very long. The actual need for our cells to function is driven in our bodies by oxygen. And in most animals, it is driven by oxygen. There are a few exceptions in the bottom of the ocean, but for the most part, everything is using oxygen that's either in the air or in the water. And it's a very complicated chemical process, but oxygen is required for the transformation of energy from whatever state it's in to a state that the cell can use to live. And it's fascinating to me that the more I learn about how cells work, then the more we learn as scientists, the more complicated it is, but the more in awe I am of life in general, that there's so much we've learned in the last 40 plus years. And there's so much we still don't know as scientists. But I will say, science doesn't have all the answers. And quite frankly, science, I believe, has used an awful lot of taxpayers' money to do research on things that David and Indigenous people have known for millennia. And, we just haven't talked to each other very well about those things. And we were talking about Zoom and Hollywood Squares here this morning before the meeting, and how important it is to communicate in person, but also how important it is to communicate across these artificial barriers like science and Indigenous knowledge, and really truly understand how the world works, because this Zoom representation of all of us in our little boxes is really a great analogy for how we function in the world, and how separate we can be from each other and from nature. And I think that, my hope is that this series about the four chiefs helps people to think about their own personal relationship with nature, and how not only you can each learn more, but how you can help us all teach the next generations how to live more respectfully, using the tools of Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge together for the good of our planet and for all of us. It's certainly been my honor to talk with David on these subjects, and I find this really fascinating. I know, David, we talked about fires, and there's so much interrelationship between these different chiefs. None of these chiefs stand alone. All totally interrelated with each other. And air, we all know from living in Southern Oregon what happens to the air when fires happen. We are the direct recipients of a lot of smoke and a lot of ill effects, health-wise and otherwise, from smoke, and how much we have to work together to see the interconnectedness. And David, would you share? I was so fascinated when you talked about how Native Americans understood fire, and I mean it's so related to what we do and what we breathe. And I just spent this morning overlooking at a device that one of our students has made that allows you to burn forest fuels inside of an enclosed container that will generate electricity and not give off pollution. And but David, you know people who understand better than anyone how to have prevented getting where we are.
That I love that they're generating electricity out of the burning of wood. I really wonder about my old people, how they would think about that electricity when they were using a bow drill to start their fires. And one of the most talked about uses of wood and for fuel for bow drills and starting fires was lightning struck trees, that they were infused with, they called it life or light. It had fire inside it. And because it had been struck and killed by the lightning, it had fire inside of it. The lightning oftentimes will hit those big trees, and when it hits, it boils the sap and it blows the tree apart. So there's an explosion of wood, and sometimes for long distances, wood can be scattered. And as that pitch got boiled, when it dried, it soaked back into the wood. And so that pitch wood, it didn't take very many strokes to get that fire going. And the quicker you could build a fire sometimes was the very best of all worlds. I had this thought about how fire was so important. And then to hear this, because I just had my property, I live on 40 acres off of Savage Creek Road, right adjacent to where Savage Rapids Park and the dam used to be. Anyway, I'm glad the dam is gone. It looks so different now. Even though there's a concern about the groundwater, the earth is much happier now. And not very many people know that area right in front of Savage Creek and the downriver side of Savage Creek. Savage Creek is a salmon bearing stream. And just that first area below where the mouth is emptying into the road, there's a gravel bed underneath there that's stopped by the protruding rock ledges that run out into the river. That's a hard rock vein that runs from the top of Fielder Mountain right down the side of the mountain, right across the river and up over the top of my property and on up into the mountains towards Murphy. Where it comes across the river, it slows the water behind it and makes a natural backwater and an eddy. That whole area is often filled with gravel that washes out of Savage Rapids or out of Savage Creek and settles in that slow water, and that's a spawning ground. And so the Rogue Fly Fishermen's Association came in with an independent contractor, and they took out all of the invasive species in the area of the old park and replanted natural species that grew at the river's edge that provided shade for the spawning salmon and the incubation of their eggs. And it's changed everything back to the way that it naturally was. So I got a grant 9 years ago from the state and the federal government to do white oak savanna restoration on my property. And I had worked closely with the Lomakatsi restoration and environmental assistance business in Ashland. And when they were first getting started, for 10 years, we had a Native American Ecological Education Symposium at SOU. And they were often featured presenters at that symposium, and it got them a reputation started. And now they have huge contracts to do fuels reduction and cool burning and oak savanna restoration and other forms of restorative forestry practices. And so I called and told them we haven't had any activity the last 3 years because of the COVID. This is the 9th year. Are we going to be able to do anything? Because I'm really concerned about the fuels reduction and I'm not able to do it anymore. They came right out. That was on a Wednesday. They came out on Thursday or on Saturday. They reviewed the property. They put the paperwork in for a second phase of it for another 10 years. That's going to be a 20-year demonstration project on white oak savanna restoration. White oaks were the food of the indigenous people. And so wherever they grew, they nurtured them and they cool burned off the other trees that weren't supposed to be there. they knew about Doug fir was not a native tree. And they nurtured the cedar and took out the Doug fir, and they nurtured the ponderosa pine. The property is actually kind of broken up with layers in strata of where different plants grow and the different trees grow. And they did that bottom half where most of the Scotch broom invasive species in there thick as my wrist. When they took it out, they did small piles, small burn piles, and they called them swamper burns. And on the day that we were to burn was rain was forecast. It was kind of sprinkly, cool day, not much wind, but a steady wind, a steady light wind. And Lomakatsi brought their native crew from Chiloquin at the Klamath Restoration, and the tribes that are made up of people in the off season that are wildland firefighters from the Wainima hotshots work for Lomakatsi in doing this forest reclamation and thinning for fire safety. They brought 21 interns from the Talent Fire District and that part of the Southern Oregon Fire District to train them in wildland firefighting techniques, but also to teach them about cool burning methods and how they would be employing cool burning methods so that the fire department, being in support to Lomakatsi providing the cool burn, can also be on hand so that the controlled burns don't get away. That used to be an old joke about you see a 60,000 acre fire and people would be joking, oh, that's one of their control burns got away from. Well, that was actually true back some years ago. But now they've learned how to do that in a different way. And also the demonstration project, it ties with youth groups that are learning about forestry practices and applying them on people's private property through these grants, so that the landowner doesn't have to provide the funding. The grants provide the funding and the training that increases the knowledge of how to deal with fuels reduction and land restoration and management. As I was going around when they started the fires, and I drove around and checked out how they were doing, I was absolutely amazed at how they started these fires in these piles, and they were only burning out to the perimeter of what had been the pile of the slash. And it didn't have any finger runs off into the dry grass or into the dry needles or anything. It absolutely blew me away. And so I had to go ask the Indian boys that had set this up. I said, what's the deal? How do you do that? And so one of the leaders said, come here, I'll show you. So we went to where they were stacking up some brush that they had generated. And he said, we always see which way the wind's blowing. He said, that soft wind that blows steady all the time. He said, not the big gusts that come off the river. He said, that little steady, soft wind. And he said, we try to figure out where that's at. And he said, we use our torches to find that. And he said, we pile our sticks in a way that draws that air in instead of forcing it out, so that when the fire is lit, the air is naturally drawn in and creates the chambering effect. And so the pile burns hot and intently, and they burn it from the center out, so that when it burns out to where there's no more fuel, it stops, because the wind is drawn in and the heat then is drawn back into the fire instead of letting it go out to the side and run the little finger fires that can continually plague you if you don't know this little trick. So I was given permission to share this. It takes a little practice, as I understand it, to do it. And the piles were not very big, but they took all of that brush and the understory and all of that Scotch broom and all of that stuff, and it's gone. I was absolutely amazed. And I said, well, how did you guys learn to do that? And the leader from Chilcotin said, our people have been using fire for thousands and thousands of years. He said, we discovered this when we started doing this again. It was our sweat lodge leaders that told us this. And that's how
Wow.
they build the sweat lodge fires, to draw the heat into the stones rather than the heat escaping out for a warming fire. And so it was just this knowledge. Here I am, a member of the people of the place of the fire, sacred firekeepers, relearning about the sacredness and relationship and use of fire. It was an auspicious day, and really quite a learning experience for me. I was very surprised by some of the information, but once I started thinking about it, it's just loaded with common sense. And he said the reason that we kind of started thinking about it more so, he said, because we always dig in fire line. He said setting back fire so that the hot fire, the wildfire, burns down into that burned over area and it stops. He said our grandmas were way smarter than us. I said, why is that? And he said, because they all summer or summer long, they'd be gathering up pine cones. And they'd put them out in the sun and they'd turn them every little bit. And pine cones, big pine cones, particularly sugar pines, weep pitch. And so they would turn them and they'd get a coating on these cones. When the end of the berry gathering and the fall time mountain hunting for the heavier game was done, and they moved back down closer to the valleys and ready water, the grandmothers would be the last ones to leave. And they would start the fires at the top of the ridge line and start a pine cone burning and then toss it down the hill. So the pine cone would go down every so far and hit the ground, bounce and throw off a bunch of pitch and stuff, bounce. As you know, in Southern Oregon, most of Oregon, you don't have to toss it very far for it to be starting to go down the hill like that, because everything is like this. So the top fire starting down would burn down to that next area that had been hit with the pine cone and had started to burn ahead, so that by the time the pine cones got clear to the bottom, down into the river bottom or the creek bottom, it would be beginning to be slowing down. They created their own backfires with pine cones and slowed the advent of the fire. And the grandmothers were pretty expert at predicting the weather. And so within just a day or two, maybe even that evening or that night, it would rain and put the fires out. And all of their basket making materials, all of the berries, everything all had fresh new growth on it the next year. That brought the game back. That's why they stayed in those areas and proliferated where there were so many of them when people first came here, other than the indigenous people. I love learning about that.
That's
Little
to me is so fascinating, just absolutely fascinating, because normally we hear about fires going uphill.
Mhm.
And they really understood the value of starting at the top.
Mhm. Yeah.
So neat, so neat. I know when we were cleaning up our property, you know, it was every morning we had to call burn line to see, can we burn today? You know, and most of the time, no, you could not burn because there was an inversion. You know, we have a lot in valleys. It's very common for there to be thermal inversions that kind of trap smoke close to the ground, and so the air has to be moving in order for you to be able to burn. And that's been a challenge for forest management in our region, is because and last year in particular, gosh, it was beginning of June, we had to stop burning, which was a month earlier than we're used to. But it's because of air quality. You know, the particulates and the smoke wind up getting trapped in those thermal layers and getting trapped close to the ground. They can't escape because the air has stratified, and you know, air at different temperatures, just like water at different temperatures, you know, it stratifies and it weighs differently. And so it just really is interesting how fire and air can be so intricately interwoven.
And used to benefit each other. Now, we had a question of why is it called cool burning? Because they did it in a time when the ground was still relatively was cooling from the summertime. They would start the fires in the morning when the dew was on the ground. And so the fire would advance slowly and just kind of creep along down the mountainside. It wouldn't be in a raging sense of how we see wildfire now, being completely out of control. It kind of just went along. I was also told that in some places that they would get it would get muskrats or different hides, sometimes raccoons and badgers. They'd get their hides and they'd soak them with water and tie them on the end of sticks and use them kind of like a damp mop. And if the fire was getting away in one spot or another, they'd go with that water soaked hide and whop, and it not only hits it with a big wad of water, but it knocks the air out from it and then puts the water on top of it, and it stops the advent of the little finger fire from going where maybe they didn't want them to burn that little bunch of brush over there because that was bear grass that they were going to use for their baskets, and it had already been burned, so they keep it out of there. I always thought that was pretty funny to see these grandmas out there whacking this fire with some animal made mops.
Yeah, doesn't that tell you something though, that you know, now you think about who's out there fighting our fires? It's, you know, young, very strong young men. But the reason is because there's so much fuel on the ground now. And, you know, the grandmothers couldn't control it now. Even if, you know, even if they wanted to, the grandmothers could not control it. There's just too much fuel on the ground. And it's totally changed how we have to manage forests. Yeah, because they were doing that every year.
Yes.
They were restoring the nutrients back into the soil and killing out invasive species, killing out insects with those cool fires that, you know, just, and you know, you're going back to the respiration rates. New plant growth has a much higher respiration rate and produces a lot more oxygen than older plants do.
Oh, cool.
And so, you know, it really is restorative to the air itself to have all that new growth coming in.
And you can see for yourself if you build a campfire and you're out somewhere where you can take the dry limbs off that are down close to the ground. They used to call that grandma wood, and they never used that wood close to, and they didn't burn that wood close to the camps. Because grandma, if it was cold outside, grandma could go out there and get some dry wood off of those lower branches to keep her fire going, to eat and to make soups and tea. She wouldn't have to go so far if everybody else was out gathering food and doing what they were doing. She could go get a bundle of wood and bring it back. But if you break that off and throw it into the fire, when you've got 50 acres of trees that are loaded like that with dead branches that are touching all the way to the ground, those are matches, they're wicks right to the top, and it turns that whole tree into a match. And that's what causes part of what causes the catastrophic wildfires. And my old friend Dennis Martinez did research all over Northern California and Southern Oregon, and became an expert on cool burning. But he said, part of the reason we're having trouble with water is because the needle mat is so deep and so dense underneath these big needle producing trees, evergreen trees. They don't stay green all the time. They do turn brown and they shed. Their needles, they have a limb that dies in the wind and falls off. And that needle mat, when those needles, just try to pick up a needle mat with a pitchfork.
It's heavy.
Heavy, and you can get a big bite of it, but as soon as you start to move it, what happens? It starts raining down the bottom. And so it's hard to disperse it. It's hard to get rid of it. It's hard to move it out. And it burns incredibly hot, so it destroys the root system and all of those nutrients that are just under the surface as well, and disrupts those connectors between the plants that they communicate with and disrupts their whole society.
Yep,
So the
absolutely.
cool burning with when everything, if we get back to doing it in a consistent manner, it will clean up that needle mat, and the forest will look like it used to around Chiloquin and the Klamath area in years past. You could see for miles underneath those huge sugar pine and ponderosa trees, and be very little brush there, except what was for food.
That's absolutely true, boy. What we think of as a forest and what the natives saw as forests that were maintained regularly by fire. I mean, what we see now is very, very different. Very different.
When they talk about, when we look at historical perspectives, and the first people that came in that kept journals, they talked about how the Eastern Woodlands, they call us the Eastern Woodlands tribes, but we didn't have so much of the evergreen type trees. Wisconsin, Minnesota had, Michigan had white pine that was highly sought after, huge forests of white pine, beautiful trees. But the rest of us had pretty much broadleaf trees. And so the canopy was incredibly thick over the top of us and had heavy mats of leaves, big leaves, maple leaves, sugar bush, or our sacred tree. And when the maple leaves fall, some of them are big as your computer screen, and they mat up like that. They hold water, but at the same time, they don't respirate well with the ground underneath it. So coal burning was done in those forests also. And that helped keep the brush down because you could travel through it. For us, the horizon wasn't 30 miles over there like the Lakota people, the Plains people. Our horizon was straight up because you just couldn't see through the forest. You couldn't see it through the forest for the trees.
Well, David, I'm hearing that there's some talk at that private landowners may not be allowed to do any more burning sometime as soon as in the next 5 years. And I don't know how much truth there is to that, but I know that our student who's working on this biomass generator, what it does is it's a chamber that allows you to slowly burn wood products, and the result of it is something called biochar, which is nothing really except the nutrients that were left from the wood that was burned. And the biochar is very highly sought after for gardens. And so his hope is that he can design a really successful device that homeowners could buy, landowners could own, and actually instead of waiting for the proper weather conditions to be able to burn, to be able to put it into this generator and burn that biomass. And my big problem with hauling it away and burning it somewhere else is that the biochar has so many nutrients in it that the trees need.
Yes.
And what this student is doing is creating a chamber that you burn it in and you return the char back out to the forest floor. But at the same time, it's generating electricity. And it's turning a generator that's generating electricity. And now I hope that we can pursue some things along those lines, because I think the reality is we have so many people living out in the woods now. It's very, very hard to do controlled burns and time them appropriately. And it's hard to convince people that that's a good thing when they're afraid that their property, their home might burn down if the fire gets away. So alternatives like a biomass generator might be a good compromise where we can still burn fuels and still get the nutrients back to where they came from. I see
also
some couple of questions out here.
That would also create less smoke in the environment.
Yes, absolutely, which is critical. The question about the mat of needles on the forest floor, does it keep the ground cool? It's a little bit of both, because it does help trap moisture in the soil. So during times of, like in the hottest part of the summer, it is protecting the soil from drying out too much. The problem becomes when that mat gets too thick. And prior to massive settlement of our lands, lightning strikes and other things would help to burn this off naturally. We talked about Smokey the Bear in our fire discussion early on, and the motto is help out, stamp out forest fires, as if all forest fires were bad.
Mm-hmm.
And our knowledge of the value of forest fires has changed. So it has to be a balance. Yes, you need needles on the forest floor to help trap water and protect the soil, but too much is not a good thing. Okay, and I see that somebody else is doing biochar also. Yeah, it's happening across the Rogue Valley, and a lot of inventiveness, I think, going on there. Now, we talk about smoke and other things. Anytime you have a carbon sink, whether it's coal buried in the ground or oil buried in the ground, or even nutrients like in the form of pine needles and leaves that are just sitting on the ground. When those light on fire, the carbon that is within those gets released into the atmosphere. And with it, and it's usually released in the form of carbon dioxide, depending on if it's oil or gas or something like that. There could be methane. There can also be, sulfur dioxide. These are all things that our atmosphere can handle in small doses, but in large doses, like the worldwide burning of coal and natural gas and petroleum products, that is more than our atmosphere can handle. And all of these are, especially our fossil fuels, those are things that were locked up in the ground. They weren't meant to be part of the carbon cycle. They were locked in the ground. And the fact that we pull them out of the ground and introduce them into the carbon cycle really upsets the balance of the atmosphere tremendously. And that's where the whole idea of greenhouse gases and global warming come from, is these gases that wind up in the atmosphere that normally wouldn't be there, because that carbon that created those gases was supposed to be locked up in the ground. And we humans, we're the ones that take it out of the ground and use it to produce energy. And so, we have to deal with the consequences of that activity and find ways to prevent that carbon and sulfur and carbon monoxide and all those other things from being a problem in our atmosphere.
That right along with that goes the methane production. And I come from a large family of cattle ranchers and dairy farmers for many generations. And one of my former students is a member of the Klamath tribes. And he went to work in Lower Brule, South Dakota. And in working with some of his students, they decided that they wanted to do a methane gas survey about, and South Dakota is also cattle country, but it's also some of the tribes there have buffalo herds. And so it became everybody's task to go and measure the methane gases at the cattle feedlots and the buffalo feedlots, where they were kind of contained and everything was kind of in one spot. So they went and measured this, and the results that they came back with was pretty amazing. That and these were high school students, that the buffalo created about about between a quarter and a half less methane than the beef cattle did, and was, as those students said, less offensive to the smell. You know, you stop and think about the pioneers moving west, and they learned from the native people, particularly across the plains, the prairies, that buffalo stand in one spot, and they make a nice big frisbee size leaving there. And when those dried, you can stack them up like pancakes and put them in the back of the wagon, in the boot of the wagon box. And when you didn't have any wood out there, nothing but grass for as far as you could see, they would use those buffalo chips to build fires to cook with. So not only did the Army kill off the ready food supply, the perfectly adapted, I might add, food supply to North America, they also cut off the firewood supply to the westward immigrating citizens. Probably not too well thought out in doing that, in ridding the Indians of their commissary. It might have worked in the South during the Civil War, but it didn't work so well here and in the plains. And so now we're looking at what do we do with this issue of the heavy methane gases being attributed to beef cattle. And so the Indians, the young people there of Lower Brule in South Dakota, suggested that ranchers begin to breed out the cattle, because there are, what did they call those? They're beefalos. They're a cross between a beef and a buffalo. And they said, well, let's just use that reverse thing of blood quantum that you used on identifying us as Indian people. As time went along and we intermarried with different people, our blood quantums became less and less until finally we'd just disappear and wouldn't be anything at all relative to blood quantum. A very carefully crafted way of getting rid of us. And the students suggested was, let's do the reverse. Let's breed out the beef. Let's have the buffaloes breed back into the beef with less methane. Buffalo has no bad cholesterol whatsoever. They don't have to eat hay in the wintertime. They perfectly forage. They don't have to be added grain when it would come time for butchering time to put weight on the beef, and they replant their own fields, buffalo. And they think it would be an economic development that would substantiate the ranchers in switching from beef to buffalo, even if they have to pay for heavier fences. I thought that a very interesting research project, and asked him if they were going to move that forward. And he said, actually, two of his students were going into the agricultural fields at the University of South Dakota, and they were definitely taking this work with them to do some extrapolation on what they found and their data collection, and put it into their programs of study Oh, that's awesome.
Isn't that just a perfect example, though, of people showing up who they not recognizing they're in a new land and there's actually something better in that new land, but they've got to bring what they had from the old land with them instead, and proliferate beef cattle because that's what they were used to in Europe, as opposed to understanding that there was something better here in the Americas that they could have used very wisely.
I've got a lot of friends in the Dakota, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho folks, and we get in these discussions about why the buffalo was such a perfect food source. And they said you could use everything on it, everything. You could just use everything. And they'd bring out these charts of how the buffalo was broken down and how it was utilized, and literally right down to their hooves as drinking cups. Everything was utilized in this being. And there was an old gentleman and was taking part in these discussions, but he hadn't said anything for a long time. When elders get real quiet and don't kind of chip into the conversation, that means they're thinking on something. And finally he spoke up and he said, he said, I think it was just silly of them folks to do away with the buffalo. He said, I have those pictures of all those great, big, huge piles of thousands and thousands and thousands of buffalo skulls that they ground into fertilizer for their farms and ranches. He said, if they would have kept a live animal, they wouldn't have had only fertilizer for one time use. They would have had fertilizer every season. The grass would grow well because the buffalo, even if they changed it to alfalfa, the buffalo would eat that alfalfa and replant it.
Yep. And the buffalo, those grass seeds were actually perfectly designed to have the seed coats broken by the digestive process of the buffalo, so that when they defecated those seeds back out onto the ground, they were ready to germinate.
Yes. If you look at the way that buffalo walk and their hooves are split. When they're such a massive animal, they weigh 1,800 to 2,000 pounds. When they would step down on the ground with their hooves and move forward, and their hoof would move off, it would open a divot in the ground, would make a little cup there, all four legs. So you get 8,000 buffalo, and sometimes they're running, they're going to punch those hooves deep into the soil and they're going to tear it up. It's just like a plowed field.
Yep, they're tilling.
Yes, they're tilling. And when they would defecate, those seeds and their poop would drop down into those little depressions that were created there. Some of them pretty heavy. A 2,200 pound buffalo bull is going to leave some dents in the ground. And if you try to pet them, don't pet the buffalo. Don't go to Yellowstone and try to pet the buffalo. You lose your pants. It's an old joke about buffalo will run you off and they'll hook people behind. They used to see that in cowboys and all different kinds of stuff. And there were some videos last year of some tourists in Yellowstone that were trying to pet one of these wild buffalo in Yellowstone, and they got charged. And the buffalo ran this woman down, knocked her to the ground, put its horn in her pants and pulled her pants right off of her, just like nobody's business, and roaring down the road with her pants fluttering off the end of her horn down the road. So now the joke in Indian country has been going around everywhere. Don't stop to pet the buffalo. Don't pet the buffalo. And I got sidetracked on that and forgot my point. But it's just that image of that. But the buffalo, then the next buffalo that's coming along behind them, where those seeds have dropped down in there, the next one that comes along pushes that dirt down on top of them, and they've replanted. It's a sequence.
And through their behavior, they replanted the prairies, and those prairie grasses, again, they're respirating, they're giving off oxygen. I visited a research center in northern Colorado, and they were actually looking at the impacts of monoculture, which, you know, humans are famous for creating massive fields of one species, and the impacts of monoculture on weather patterns, and the fact that we have created a tornado alley in the center of our country through our agricultural practices. And it has impacted weather patterns and created a perfect storm, if you will, for the creation of tornadoes. I thought, what a fascinating thing.
How does that happen to have just one crop? How does that make a hurricane or a tornado? I'm not a hurricane, a tornado.
It has to do with the rate of respiration of that species. And if you have thousands of acres of the same plant, all giving off oxygen at the same rate, as opposed to a mixed species where every species is giving things off at different rates, somehow it is creating drafts and in the atmosphere.
That may have something to do with the old, what they called buffalo grass. They said they always knew what was a rich pasture because the buffalo grass would be as tall as a buffalo's eye. That it was very, very tall grass. And then there were other grasses that were shorter in their height range. And so when the buffalo grass was harvested out or cut down to make way for crops, it changed the dynamics of the small to the tall, and the air moving through it changed and created those,
yeah,
the way the wind swam.
Yep. And a lot of what replaced that tall grass was very, very short, which allowed the wind to build speed.
Drove people crazy instead of giving them songs.
Very, very true. Yeah. When I visited Costa Rica, you know, cattle was a really interesting topic there, because a group of American expatriates moved during the late 60s and early 70s to Costa Rica to avoid the draft. And they took with them cattle, and they moved to some mountainous regions. The one that I was visiting was Monteverde, and it had been settled by American expatriates who cleared the rainforests and brought these cattle in and started a massive dairy production there. And, you know, to them, this was very entrepreneurial, and, you know, what country doesn't need milk in their eyes? You know, they thought this was a really great thing to do. But over time, you know, millions of acres of rainforest were wiped out in order to raise cattle and dairy cattle. And you know, the people of Costa Rica have recognized that this wasn't a good decision, and that, you know, there was plenty of flat land and valleys where this could have been done. It didn't need to be happening up in the rainforests and the mountainous regions. And as a country, we've got a lot we can learn from a little country like Costa Rica. They are 100% on renewable energy. Everything is either water or geothermal or wind. They burn no fossil fuels at all to generate energy. They have done extensive research into how to restore their rainforests, and they have learned that the best way to restore a rainforest is from the edges of existing rainforests, because they create their own weather. And you know, when you have that dense of and diverse a population of plants giving off in what's typically a pretty hot and humid environment, they make their own rain. And it's very hard to go out into an empty field in the middle of Costa Rica and try to plant a bunch of rainforest plants, because they can't make their own rain when they're young, only when they're associated with larger adult plants. So they've really set about very deliberately to expand the edges of their rainforest back into these fields that had been cleared for livestock. And it's very successful. The other thing they've done that I think is really interesting is they truly understand their animal population's migratory patterns. And they have created national preserves that protect the migratory routes of their land migrating animals, so that they have access and can move freely about the country, without being impeded by a city. If you've ever been to Colorado, if anybody's ever been to Rocky Mountain National Park, the city of Estes Park grew up right in the middle of an elk migratory route. And the elk used to migrate between what's now federal forests and the national forests. And they went right through where the city of Estes Park is located. And the city has basically blocked that migratory route. And, a few elk still wander through town, but the massive migrations of thousands and thousands of elk has stopped, which means the elk are trapped. And the elk that are trapped inside that national park are overgrazing that park. And you can see it when you drive around the park. You can see how they've damaged trees in the wintertime, because there's so many elk that they're literally peeling the bark off of trees to try to survive during the winter. So yeah, it's interesting that we don't pay attention sometimes until we've really done the damage, and then looking back, say, how do we fix this? Air is a scary one for me, because we as a country are starting to get educated about air pollution, and we have policies about environmental standards and targets, and industry having to put scrubbers on smokestacks. But across the world, in China, those rules don't exist. And China is probably now the largest burner of fossil fuels in the world. Just because we have protections against air pollution in this country doesn't mean other countries have. And we all pay the price.
That's very true. At the beginning of the pandemic, and people were isolated, and communities and cities were shut down, and people weren't commuting, they weren't traveling and stuff. And there were numbers of like Rio de Janeiro, they hadn't seen the mountains in 30, 40 years. And all of a sudden there's the mountains. And other places, the same thing. They hadn't been able to see the land around them. Nobody had seen them for years. And they were absolutely amazed when the skies cleared and they could see that far. That's devastating. What's that doing to people's lungs?
That happened in India also.
Yeah. Yes. New Delhi, I believe it was. The Dalai, somebody was telling me, one of Grandma Aggie's friends, she was really kind of amazingly close to the Dalai Lama. And for some reason, the family kind of stayed in touch with some of the people that are his helpers, the people that work for him within the Buddhist monks. And he was so amazed that he said he could see the way home. The first time that he'd been able to see the way that he would have to go to his home. And I thought that just amazing that here's this most holy man unable to see the way back to where he needed to be, because that's what Grandma told him when she met him. She took him a condor feather, a thunderbird feather, sent her a tail feather from a condor, and her ankle was broken, and they were going to have to leave her at the bottom of the mountain that he lives on in India, about 2.5 miles up, because she couldn't walk up there. And so the other grandmothers were getting ready to leave. And these folks showed up with a burden basket,
Mm.
a taxi. And she said, "Oh, you should have seen them, son. There were 6 of them, strappingest, handsomest young men." She said, "And they just got me right in there and picked me up." She said, "And zip up the side of that mountain we went." She was very impressed with those good-looking, strong young men. And that would have been her very much. But when they got there and were inside and waiting for his evidence to arrive, they told him, "Now you can't touch him. He's not to be touched." So he doesn't do that. And she said she was visiting with somebody, which nobody's surprised that she was visiting with someone and didn't hear that. So when he came out, she jumped up on her broken ankle with her cane and jumped across the room and grabbed him and gave him a big hug. And the guards were coming in to get her off of him. And he stopped them and hugged her back and welcomed her and shook her hand and escorted her back over to her seat and sat down. And at an appropriate point, she brought out this feather to present to him. And she said he was just amazed by it and asked her what kind of bird, that he had seen birds like that where he was from. And so those big birds in the Andes or in the Himalayas would have been very similar to that condor.
Yeah.
And she told him about the thunderbird, and he understood that. And he said to her, "Would you pray for me?" And she said, "I was so taken back, I didn't know quite what to say. But then I thought, well, of course." And I told him, yes, I would be honored to do so. And he said, "Well, let's go out." She said, where do you live? Where's your home?" And she said they went out on the balcony. And they're standing on the balcony of his quarters, his home, and they're looking up towards Nepal. And he said, "My home is that way." And she said, "That's when I knew what I had to do." She said, "I just turned that feather that direction and I just started praying for him." And she said, "I just prayed for that Chinese government to find their humanity and their compassion and let that man return to his home, because he's a sacred being and the earth is out of balance because he's not in his place.
Mm.
He needs to be. He's a corner pin of the earth in human form." And she said, when I got done praying, she said, I looked and she said, here, both of us tears were running. And she said, I gifted him that feather and we had a great visit. And then I came home. About a week later, posted on Facebook is a picture of the Dalai Lama kneeling on a platform, and he's holding that condor feather to his forehead. And all around him, as far as you can see, are Buddhist monks, all with their heads down, praying. He's praying with that condor feather that grandmother gave him.
Yeah, it's so interesting, David, because many of us, I think, are raised believing that we're humans that maybe seek to live a spiritual life.
Mhm.
I wonder how different the world would be if we saw ourselves as spirits living in a human shell.
Oh, very different. That's exactly the native perspective. Everything has a spirit.
Yeah.
Everything lives, including the rocks, the land, the air, the fire, the water. And it's all in how we approach it. And we have to approach it with respect. And it's a great teacher for us, the earth itself, and those relationships of interconnectedness are great teachers for us to honor the relationships that we develop and to be careful with how and what we say, to think before speaking, because words have power and once given are hard to take back. And but that can happen. Those things can be mended. They can be healed because they came with breath. They can be mended with breath. and with words.
The willingness to listen.
The willingness to listen. Yes. That's the biggest teacher of all, is the willingness to listen. You have to be willing to listen.
When you mentioned the condor feathers, it reminded me, I used to work for a scientist who was studying the California condor and working very hard to restore the condor populations. And he had a huge impact on that. But to me, it just seems so curious that this person, this scientist, was who people listened to. And for thousands of years, Indigenous people knew the value of the condor and its place.
Mhm,
And this selective listening
mhm.
is our problem.
It is. That's exactly what our elders tell us. And they use the terminology. They no listen. They just no listen. I don't know if I told the story of the little Eskimo lady who told us about the land bridge theory from the Cape Prince of Wales. I don't know if that was in one of the other segments or not, but I think I'll tell it quickly. How's our time?
12 minutes.
Perfect. I was working for a social service agency in Alaska while I was in my master's program there. And they invited us to a conference in Cape Prince of Wales. And if you look at the map of the United States and Russia, at the top where the land bridge exists, that's Prince of Wales, Cape Prince of Wales, and the village of Prince of Wales. On the other side is Russia. In between the two are Little Diomede and Big Diomede Islands. It's 38 miles across the water from one side to the other, from the United States and Russia. Very close. Yupik Eskimos on both sides. So we get there, we're staying in people's homes in this little small community, right off of one of the last fingers of the Brooks Ridge that dives down into the sea of the shelf, and ancient peoples. They're right there. And so on the third day of this conference, one of the people in our group asked the mayor of the village, could you share with us, we've conducted most of our business that we came to the conference for, could you share the story of the land bridge, your folks' perception and understanding of the land bridge theory and of the migration from Europe into North America and the populating of North America via Europe and the land bridge south? His face just, you hear stories about the stoic Indian face. Well, he had the stoic Eskimo face. Boom, there was nothing. He shut right down. But his arms looked like that and he said, it's lunchtime. That was it. We got up and out the door, everybody went for lunch. And he did not look happy when we were leaving. So we all go to our respective homes that we're staying in and eating, and we're having their food. It's kind of feast day. And we were eating black walrus meat, and spotted seal meat, and salmon, and other kinds of fish. And oh, it was a marvelous meal. But we got done talking and visiting and munching around, and we looked around, and the family that we were staying with were not there. They'd gone. So all of the invitees and stuff from other places, we're all moving back up the road, going to the community hall. We get up to the community hall and the door's locked. This is not a community where people lock their doors. They're extremely isolated. And to find the community hall door locked was quite a surprise to us. And we thought, oh boy, we've done something bad here. We messed up. You're in trouble. The guy that asked them to tell the story. Finally, here comes this gentleman that sent us off to lunch, and he lets us in. The entire village is sitting in a half circle. And there are these 7 older men sitting in chairs out in front, sitting in between them and up to their shoulders, close to their shoulders with each other, are these younger men. Right behind them and between their shoulders are their wives, their age. Behind them are the grandmothers and the aunties and the older women. And in the middle of going back into the corner of this half horseshoe, half moon, actually quarter moon figure, is the babies. In the very corner is this very, very, very ancient grandmother in a beautiful jacket that's called a kaspak. It's like a short skirted jacket that covers far enough about mid calf or mid thigh, and then from the thigh down kind of over mid calf is ruffles around, and it's made out of gingham material, and they have great big pockets on them. It's like their apron and their multi-use little jacket, and she's got this beautiful yellow one on. This gentleman stands up and he looks around at us and he said, "So," he said, "you folks, you ask us our story about the land bridge." He said, "Grandma's going to tell you our story about land bridge, but," he said, "first, Grandma wants me to ask a question." Okay. He looks out at everybody in the room and he said, "First of all, are there any anthropologists in the room?" Everybody shake. "No, we're social services people. No anthropologists." He said, "Good." He said, "Anybody going to take this story and write it in a book?" No. He said, "Grandma gives you permission to tell the story if you tell it the way she tells it, and only the way that she tells it. And you can't put it in a book, and you can't write an archaeological paper or have an archaeological, anthropological opinion about what we say." Okay? Okay. So he goes and sits down. Grandma gets up. She says, "In the long ago time," she said, "we have a story." But she said, "First, let me ask again, is there any anthropologists in this room?" Nobody. No hands go up. She said, "That's good." She said, "because every time we tell this story, they take our story, they change it for their own purpose, and they make money off of it, and they write book. Don't write book was what I tell you." Okay. She said, "In the long ago time," and the way she was standing, she said, "in the long ago time down this way," and pointed to the United States side, "there was a people came from down this way. We had never seen anybody else until they came from that way. And they came and they stayed here with us. They ate our foods just like you did. And they rested with us. And then they went across over that way." She said, "But land bridge?" She said, "Yeah, every so often the ocean goes back." And she said, "The land will come up tall because the ocean has gone back." And she said, "But the ocean comes back." She said, "Ice freezes 30 feet deep. You could walk on the ice any day. The only place you have to be careful is in the middle, because that's where it's deep. That's where the whales swim back and forth on both sides of the top." Okay. She said, "So they went across over that way after they stayed with us. They went across over that way to other side, to our relatives living on the other side. We hear they went off over that way." She said, "And here they come back. Long time later, they come back." She said, "And they stay with us. They visit with us. They rest with us." She said, "Wasn't the same people. It was long time ago, but they was from those same people." She said, "And then they went back down this way that they first had come." And she said, "And we know this to be true." And all of these 7 men that were sitting out in the front of this quarter moon circle are sitting in their chairs, kind of kicked back. And she said, "Because we have this." And when she said that and made a motion with her body and took something out of the pocket of her cusput, every one of those men sat bolt upright in their chairs and were watching us with eagle eyes. And she said, "We traded this for something from us. She said, this is what they gifted us and traded us. It's a Mayan sun god. Clay,
Oh, wow.
Mayan sun god. She wrapped it back up. She put it back in her pocket. And she said, we traded them and gifted them a carved female walrus and her pup, and out of ivory. She said, and there's a mark on the bottom of that walrus. We know that mark to this day. That was first people we ever saw that we traded for. And she said they went down this way, but only after they came from that way, went that way and came back and went down. And that's our story. And that's what we believe. And we found out later that those 7 men sitting in the front of that were all of the walrus and whaling captains for that community. Those were the lead men of that village, and all of the men behind them were their crews and their families that supported their crews. And she said, her final thing that she said was, she said, and for you to know, for us, we have always been right here. We don't exist anyplace else. We only come and live from right here. Walrus put us here to live. And we still live in here to this day. And that was the end of the story. And there was a lot of people that were there that heard, about 30 social service workers that heard that story. The village still knows the story. So if you ever have an opportunity to go Cape Prince of Wales, you might want to ask somebody if they'll tell you the story and assure them that you're not an anthropologist.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you for that, David.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, and you brought us right to the end of our time together. So a great big thank you to Kathy and to David for sharing stories with us, for sharing your knowledge, both from the Indigenous perspective and the Western scientific world. And hopefully we all use that for the preservation and the conservation of our precious resources. So I hope you all have a great afternoon. And
Yes,
thanks.
me too.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
This has been a great deal to me. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. My honor.
Later.